Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Authors and Insights. Today, we are very honored and excited to have Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch with us. Ambassador Yovanovitch has a 33-year distinguished career as an ambassador of the United States, having served as ambassador in Ukraine, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. But of course, you've served in many other countries, and we might touch upon some of that. We definitely want to touch upon your experience in Ukraine and also the lessons that you've derived from that, personally, professionally. And then, because we are really nearing the anniversary of this latest phase of the horrible war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, we would like to take some time to mine your brain, to give us some of your insights about where we are today, whether our policy is the right one, how you think this will all end. So let me start really with the book. Obviously, this is a book series, and we encourage our audience to tune into our other events in the series. You wrote the book over a year ago now, but it's still very timely. But you must have had a reason to write it besides just because Ukraine was in the headlines. Can you give us a sense of why you wrote the book?
Yeah. So I wrote the book because after I testified publicly in former President Trump's first impeachment, I got thousands of letters from all over America with people saying, thank you for your service. They all had their individual messages, but many of them said, we didn't know about the Foreign Service. We didn't know about the State Department. We didn't know what diplomats do. Tell us more. Please write a book. And so I ended up retiring in January of 2020, and I thought, I think I'll write a book. This had never been part of the plan, but I sat down and I wrote this book, and I had many reasons to write it, including wanting to share with the American people what diplomats do and how we protect and defend the American people, no less so than people in the armed services. And we work on prosperity issues, we work on freedom issues, and we work on security issues every single day. And I wanted people, through my stories, to see how we do that. But I also wanted to honor my parents, who were immigrants to this country.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. And, they really inspired me in many different ways, and I wanted to honor them. There are many other reasons that I wrote the book, but I'll leave it there.
Mm-hmm. And why did you join the Foreign Service?
Well, I joined the Foreign Service very much because of my parents' influence. They came to this country as immigrants with very, very little, in fact, pretty much nothing. And they were, so grateful to be in this country because they had both lived under authoritarian regimes. So they knew what it was, not to be able to worship as you please, not to be able to say what you wanted to say, to live in fear.
Right.
And when they came to the United States, they were just grateful that none of those things applied, and they brought my brother up and I to value that and to understand that we needed to give back, that we were fortunate to live in the United States, and we needed to give back in some way, whatever way we wanted. My parents were both teachers, I along the way, after college, I took a couple of detours, but I loved foreign policy and politics and traveling. And the Foreign Service was a way of doing all of those things and getting paid for it and serving the American people. So it was, it was definitely for me. And so that's how I ended up in the Foreign Service.
And you also probably, I'm going to infer a little because I'm the child of Hungarian refugees, and your parents, if I recall correctly, your father was of Yugoslav origin, spoke Russian. Your mother was of Russian origin, who grew up in Germany, if I recall correctly. And I'm wondering, you must have also had a culture at home, a language at home, and then you had to balance that, and that probably also made you skilled. I'm leading the witness here as a diplomat.
Well, actually, my parents were each half Russian, but my mother did not speak Russian. And so at home we, long story, I'll make it short, when we moved to the United States, we spoke English at home. And so I learned Russian in college. The hard way.
Yes, exactly. Well, I wanted to start with that just so that the audience had a sense of who you are and what brought you to service. There's another person who looms large. We're at the McCain Institute for his service, and that is Senator John McCain. As you know, he served our country first as a naval aviator, was taken as a prisoner of war and held for 5.5 years in Vietnam. Much of that time he was in isolation, so alone. And then he came out and decided to run for Congress and then for House and then the Senate. Served his entire life, basically, his entire adult life in service. And he was also very much a maverick, not bound by party. You had a chance to host him. You were the last ambassador to host him in Ukraine. And as you know, he went to Ukraine many times. He was someone who fought for frontline democracies, not just Ukraine, but others. And I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit. In your book, you talk about going to the front line with Senator McCain, Senator Lindsey Graham, and Senator Amy Klobuchar with then President Poroshenko. And you write about how you were moved by Senator McCain's response to some of the Ukrainian troops who were telling them their stories. Can you talk a little bit about Senator McCain, what impression he had on you, and also his relationship with the Ukrainian people?
Yeah. So thank you for asking that question, because I think it's important for people to understand that, obviously the executive branch leads on foreign policy, but it's really important that we have the support of Congress on budget issues, but also on leadership issues of where the U.S. stands. And I think Senator McCain, when it comes to Ukraine, really led the way and led our support. He was so strong and he was so compassionate at the same time with the Ukrainian people. We had an event at my house where he met with a number of people touched by the war, because as you know, of course, the war did not start in 2022.
Right.
It started in 2014. And, he met with people who had been released as POWs, obviously, close to his heart. He met with people who had been wounded. He met with others who were still missing their relatives. And Crimean Tatars who had been chased out of Crimea, for the second time in their lifetime, in our collective memory, as you recall, after World War II, the Crimean Tatars were deported from Crimea by Stalin. And so, here he is a legend, but in that living room, he was a man who understood and who was providing comfort to people who needed it and leadership to people who needed it. So President Poroshenko, going to your question, President Poroshenko in the meeting, the protocol meeting, he sort of casually said, hey, tomorrow I'm going to the front lines. Do you want to go? I mean, can you imagine a senator who would say no? So we all scrambled. And
well, most other senators would say no, but not Senator McCain.
Maybe.
The front line of a war. Let's go.
Yeah. So we went out. And actually through Mariupol, which obviously is a hero city. And we went to the front lines, met with a number of people, a number of soldiers who got medals, and then we went to where the Marines were stationed, and many, many more soldiers got medals. And there was, and so this is, by now, it's about 8 o'clock at night. It is freezing cold. It is pitch dark. And Senator McCain is standing there in a wool coat because, he wasn't expecting to go into the freezing front lines, in a wool coat and, thin leather shoes, no hat. And he's just stoic in this freezing cold. And there's this young woman who was called up by President Poroshenko. And so I'm kind of whispering to him what's going on, that she is the mother of a young man who had just been killed on the front lines recently. And she was going to get the medal for her son. And it was very, very touching. And Senator McCain said, should I go up there? And I'm like, yeah, go on up there. And he just hugged her, and these two little streams of tears went down his eyes. And it was, I don't think there was a dry eye in the house. I don't think I have a dry eye now, just recalling it. But it was, an example of how a courageous man can be so empathetic and really win hearts and minds. And, he is loved in Ukraine for his staunch leadership and, get them javelins, long before anybody knew about javelins. But
they named a street after him, too.
Yes, exactly. But he is also loved because of his understanding of the situation, the human cost of war.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. We appreciate it. We are trying to keep his legacy alive here, not just his personal legacy, but really the legacy of service, putting yourself second and essentially helping your country and helping others. We do advance democracy here. We work for human rights. We work in the states now, bolstering democracy, which was something we didn't have to do until about 2 years ago. And of course, globally, we work primarily on frontline states, and then we help exiles from Syria and Russia and other places like that. So that's my little advertisement for the McCain Institute.
Well, what a great way to keep that legacy alive and to do real good at a time that it's needed.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And that's only some of our work. So I wanted to go back to you. In the prologue, you mentioned that you're going to take the reader through your various tours of duty, starting in Somalia. Then, of course, you had Armenia, you had Russia. I'm saying it probably in the wrong order. You had Ukraine. Then you went to Kyrgyzstan and then back to Ukraine. And you tell the reader in the beginning, you are reflecting on the state of American democracy. And you're saying, hopefully, by going through and reading my book and understanding the experiences of other countries, we as Americans, and perhaps the reader, can be better informed about how we can help essentially shore up our own democracy. Now, having read the book, written the book, put it down, you've been speaking and doing a lot of other things and watching as things have developed in our country. Do you feel that there are lessons, and what lessons would you point to that have come out of your experience and the experience of those countries that Americans should draw on today?
Yeah. So I think, both, observing what is happening in the United States as an American citizen and observing as an American citizen what is happening worldwide and happened in the countries that I served in. I think, the fundamental lesson, which I think, even though my parents kind of ingrained this in me, I forgot somewhere along the way. I took our democracy for granted. Yeah. I took our freedoms for granted, and we can't do that. We need, I use the word fight. I don't mean that, literally. I mean it in the sense that we need to defend and protect and nurture our democracy and all the values that the United States stands for. And I think we can see that in the U.S. today. I think we're in a better place than we were on January 6th. But as our military colleagues say, freedom isn't free.
Right.
We need to nurture our democracy every day, and everybody needs to do their little bit. And I think that's true in the U.S. I think it's true abroad as well.
Yeah, and I think if we fast forward to Ukraine and your experiences there, clearly the Ukrainians, maybe it wasn't as clear in 2014 to some people, but the Ukrainians have been fighting not just for their democracy, but frankly for everyone's democracy, everyone's freedom, for the international order, because Russia wanted to start with Ukraine, frankly. That's me editorializing, but I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on your time there and how things are different today from when you were there.
Yeah. Before I do that, I'd just like to foot stomp what you just said. Okay. I think you are absolutely right. The Ukrainians are fighting our fight as well. They are standing up for freedom in a really important way. And I think for us, sometimes it looks like Ukraine is so far away and that it's a little theoretical, and we have, other priorities here at home, which, we certainly do have a lot of priorities here at home, but Ukraine is not so far away. And, when President Zelensky was here, he, as so often happens, he said it better than most, and he noted to Congress that our assistance is not charity. It is an investment in our security and global security, because Russia is not going to stop in Ukraine if it is successful in Ukraine. It's going to keep on going. And how do we know that? We know that because Vladimir Putin has told us. Right. And we look at his actions over time. We look at his writings. We look at what he has said and the other lands that he aspires to. And so it is much better for us, for the world, for Ukraine, if Ukraine is successful in beating back Russia. And so we need to provide as much assistance as we can to Ukraine as quickly as possible. And it is very, very critical right now, as I don't need to tell you.
If I can interrupt for one second.
Sure.
And because the other danger is that the war spreads. But back to you, sorry.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, President Biden has been very clear that we don't want to, any kind of enlargement of the war. And I think, one of the things, for as much as we've heard our people talk about red lines of Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin indicating the same, in fact, it's not clear what his red lines are and if he has any. But it's also clear that he and his troops are doing the utmost to make sure that they do not violate NATO borders.
Yeah.
And that is very clear.
Yeah, and that's what I mean by there is a danger it could spread to NATO inadvertently or over time if we don't defeat Russia in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, completely agree.
So sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, so where were we?
I made you lose your train of thought. Well, 2014 versus today, a little bit of reflection on that. And
in terms of the democracy issue, right?
Yes,
Yeah. Well, so I think what we've seen over time, and I'm going to take us back through history.
Yeah.
Not too far
And
back.
I haven't touched on Trump and the impeachment and how it was that you left the Foreign Service. I don't know if we'll have time for that, but if you want to weave that in there as well, reflecting on that, that's great too.
Okay. Ukraine and the other former Soviet republics gained independence in 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. And, in elections since then, in two peaceful revolutions, in two wars, the Ukrainian people have been very clear that they want to be part of the West.
Right.
They want to live according to Western values. They believe in the rule of law. They want to end, if not end, at least manage corruption in their country. And that has been very clear. And in 2014, they had the Revolution of Dignity, which again means we want to live by the rule of law. And Yanukovych, even though he had a deal to stay on, he fled the country. And that ushered in Poroshenko and many, many reforms. And what happened was that civil society, which in the previous revolution, the Orange Revolution in 2004, civil society had also kind of sparked that revolution, but people went back to their everyday lives. They were like, okay, we won, and now we're going to trust the politicians to do what they need to do.
Right.
And it didn't go so well. There was a lot of backsliding and a lot of disappointment. And so in 2014, civil society members, people did they made their own decisions, but some people joined the parliament, some people joined the government, some people stayed in civil society but continued to write draft laws and agitate and so forth. And this is what we do in the United States too, right? There's sort of the in and out of people going in and out of politics and participating in the democratic process. That was kind of new for Ukraine. And it was very effective because the reformers in government, the reformers in civil society, and the international community all came together and moved forward with reforms. And I think that was a really effective model. The thing is, for every season there is a time, and reform is hard, and so, you have that impetus in the beginning, and then you kind of lose your edge and everything else. So by the time I got there 2 years later, a lot had been done, still a lot that needed to happen, but, people were a little tired, especially in the government. And so, we kept on trying to push through reforms, but, and civil society was still there, as adamant as ever. And you would think that a war like this one would kind of suppress civil society, and that with the centralization of power, which happens in every country that is at war, that somehow civil society would kind of melt away. But that's not what's happening. What you are seeing is kind of the mobilization, basically, of every single person in Ukraine, where people are seeing tasks. Oh, does somebody need to be driven to the hospital? Do I need to do, take a CPR course so that I can provide assistance? Do I need to set up a food hall here? People do what they can, and they don't do it because President Zelensky said you need to do X.
Right.
They do it because they see a need, and they see that they can fill it, and so they are supporting their country and the troops in that way. And it's really kind of inspiring. But the more formal parts of civil society, if you can actually even say that sentence, people with organizations who may have been working on various issues. They are also doing those things, and many of them are, come here to Washington or to Berlin or London or Paris to advocate for Ukraine with our politicians and our representatives. But many of them are in Ukraine working on those same issues or working on issues to support the troops, support civil society. They have not gone away, and they are going to be the vanguard, I believe, when Ukraine wins this war.
Yeah, it is interesting to see because President Zelensky, when this latest phase of the war broke out in 2022, about a year ago, he was under pressure. People were dissatisfied with how much progress he had been making, even though he was elected on an agenda of anti-corruption, but they felt he wasn't making enough progress. They were very clear about their view, they being members of civil society and the opposition. Today, we see, of course, Ukraine is getting a lot of assistance, and they are going to have to really ramp up anti-corruption. We saw recently, of course, that President Zelensky did take some action when he found corruption. Speaking of corruption, just briefly before we get into kind of Ukraine today and prognosticating a little, if you could comment briefly on your experience coming out of the impeachment. You had, and if you read the book, you demonstrate a lot of strength in that book, especially as a woman coming up in the ranks of the State Department. There are a lot of lessons for younger people in there, or people who get a leg up because of gender or ethnicity. You give a really good kind of rationale there for, sure, take the help, and then it's what you do with it that matters, which I thought was phenomenal, reading it myself as a woman. But then you also go through this horrendous experience where you're caught up in, frankly, our president, then President Trump's corruption scheme, his corrupt scheme, to try to get a foreign government to intervene in our elections, basically to try to get President Zelensky to come up with some dirt on President Biden based on his son's activities in Ukraine. And essentially you were the person with standards and ethics, and you were representing the president, although he was corrupt. And so you were in the way in the estimation of Rudy Giuliani and others who were helping the president, and you became a casualty. Just if you could quickly, so that we can turn to the president, but talk a little bit about what advice you would have to someone who is in a similar situation. It wasn't really personal, but yet it was.
Yeah, it sure felt personal.
Yeah.
Although, with time and distance, I realized it could have been anybody. But I think you need to know who you are.
Yeah.
And I think that, people talk about integrity and ethics, but what's more important is modeling it and acting in an ethical and a way that is full of integrity. And you can't start when you are a leader, when you're an ambassador or a president or something like that. I mean, it's a muscle like any other. You need to exercise it when you have a tough decision. And the thing about these kinds of situations is that, they're hard. And there may not be a black and white answer. I mean, if there is, it's probably pretty easy to make that choice, although it may be hard in terms of the consequences. But often there are grays, and so you need to make the best decision that you can. And I think, the decision that allows you to get up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror. Did I do the best thing that I could under the circumstances? And, I also have these real people or real experts who, study these things, kind of poo-poo my little tests. But I have these two really simple tests. Okay. One is, if I can't, if I'm unhappy that what I just did, the decision I just made, ended up on the front pages of the New York Times, that's a clue that maybe I'm going in the wrong direction.
Right.
And the other thing is, if you can't explain to your family why what you did was right, that's, again, another clue. Now, it may be that, the situation is so complicated and so sophisticated that, only true experts can understand. But probably not. Probably not. And so, I just think it's important to, start in the beginning and try to be, your best you. And we all make mistakes. So the next day you just get up and you try again. Yeah.
And even if it's not your family, I have a friend that I consider kind of an ethical I don't know, standard.
Right.
And I will often call him and say, should I accept this honorarium or
Right.
what have you, this doesn't, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah.
And he's so correct and proper that I know I can call him.
Yeah. That's
so,
really valuable.
Yeah. So let me take us to today.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, we are a year into this phase of the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
The United States, as we kind of alluded to, has been providing increased and strong military, economic, political support to Ukraine. Do you think we're doing enough?
Well, the short answer is no. We're not doing enough, but we're doing a lot. And if you and I were to had this conversation a year ago, we would never have forecast,
right?
So many
tanks,
things. Tanks, exactly. We just would not have, forecast the kinds of security assistance we're providing, the volume, the speed. I mean, this is a logistical miracle almost that we are getting so much to Ukraine so quickly. That said, they need more and they need it faster. Because both sides are ramping up for what we've been hearing about for weeks now, spring offensive.
Right.
And both sides have clear challenges in mounting those offensives, and so we need to help Ukraine get into the best position possible so that they are as successful as possible on the ground. Because as you know, of course, I mean, what happens on the ground is going to determine the peace.
Right. So let me ask you this then, how do you think this will end?
Well, it's, that's my least favorite question.
I know, I'm sorry. Okay. But what are the options?
I don't have a crystal ball.
Or actually, you know what? I do have another question, which you can answer if you want, or as a secondary one, which is, what if Russia loses? What will the world look like?
That is a really good question. And of course, it also means one has to define what loss means, just as one has to define, in the previous question, what does victory mean for either side? And I think those are some of the unknowables where, maybe Russia gets to keep some of what it has illegally annexed, some of what it hasn't even annexed but is claiming. I personally would not be in favor of that because it rewards aggression.
Right.
And we cannot be in that kind of a world. I'm one of the people who believes that we did not send strong enough signals, we did not act strongly enough, in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014 to dissuade Russia from thinking that this is the way I can get stuff done. Yes, there will be some criticism, maybe there'll be a couple of sanctions, but I can still kind of bowl my way through this because that's been the history of the last 20 years. And if we allow that to happen again, I will bet you money we will see Russia trying again when they think that we have lost interest, our attention has turned to something else, we're just tired, we have internal issues, and they will try again. And so that's I think that would be in some ways, other than Russia taking all of Ukraine, I think that would be one of the worst outcomes actually. Because again, what we saw in 2014-15, we saw France and Germany negotiate the Minsk agreements, and they weren't actual peace deals. I mean, they were ceasefires, and Russia did not do a single thing that it was supposed to do. Ukraine did some of the things that it was supposed to do, but was looking for some good faith efforts from Russia as well. And so we continue to have this low-level war where 3 or 4 Ukrainians died every week. And I just don't think that after the last many years since 2014, that is a tolerable situation, and one that brings kind of a lasting equilibrium to the region.
So this is my last question, but it's the question I asked before, but I'm going to ask it maybe a little more clearly. If Russia loses, meaning Russia does not get rewarded at all, in fact, Russia's held accountable for the human rights atrocities that they've committed in Ukraine and in Syria and elsewhere, and Russia doesn't get to keep territory, and Russia's foreign policy changes, whether that means it's Vladimir Putin still in the Kremlin, probably unlikely, or someone else. what does that world look like if you don't have a Russia with an aggressive foreign policy? And, I'm going to lead you a little. You served in Armenia, you served in Kyrgyzstan. Obviously, there'll be some risks because there'll be more competition that Russia tamped down in Armenia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But can you give us a more of an optimistic picture, or pessimistic, whichever way you want to go? What would it look like if Russia's really defeated, if this foreign policy is defeated?
Well, I mean, I think that if that happens, I mean, you kind of posited that Putin is no longer in power. Maybe not, but maybe. And then the question is, who succeeds him, and is that better or worse? I was of the view before that it couldn't be better, and probably probably will be worse in some ways, in the sense that. I think the hard men around Putin, one of those individuals is likely to be the successor, and many of them, we understand, are even more hardline than Putin. But are they going to have the grip on Russia that Putin seems to have right now? Are nuclear arsenals going to be secure? All of those kinds of questions. And then there's the issue of empire. I mean, so we think about the Soviet Union and the republics, being hived off, Ukraine being the prime example. But within Russia itself, there are many constituent states and ethnicities. And are they going to want to, through civil war, through mediation, negotiation, are they going to want their own independence? I think that there will be a period of sorting out. We thought that we had escaped that in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart. That, weren't we lucky? The plane landed and there was no crash, there were no wars. I mean, with some
Small
exceptions.
wars, yeah.
Yeah. But I think that the reckoning is probably going to come. And so we need to think about how we manage that. But when I say how we manage that, I say that advisedly, because it's going to be Russian leaders, the people in the constituent republics, et cetera, who are going to be managing it. They are the most significant actors in their own in their own countries. We basically work on the margins,
right?
And we need to be humble about that. And I think the first thing is first do no harm. Yeah. And so. I'd like to be very optimistic about the future. I mean, I think that a Ukrainian victory is important, and I think that's the most likely outcome over time. But I also think that it doesn't mean that it's going to be all rainbows and puppies out there. There's going to be some serious work that needs to be done in the region, but also I would say globally, because when we talk about the support that Ukraine has gotten from the West, that is true. But there are many, many more countries that are not supporting Ukraine, that see this fight as something about European security issues, that see it as a distraction from their own very real challenges. And so I think it's important that we also, and many people, including yourself, are thinking hard about this. What does the new global order look like? How can we create something that reflects the world as we see it today, including the new players, and how do we better manage not only the old challenges, which are still there, but the new challenges like climate and so many other things that are out there that are real challenges for many countries, including our own. And so I think there's some real work that needs to be done. But here's the thing. It's a crisis, and you never waste a good crisis.
Yes, exactly. Well, on that
note,
so
many opportunities.
On that note, I thank you so much for coming to be here at the McCain Institute today, Ambassador Yovanovitch, Masha. And thank you to our audience. Please check out the McCainInstitute.org, our website, for updates on when the next Authors and Insights will be held. Also to view past interviews. And thank you again for your time. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much.